I had managed to avoid using dating apps for a long time, but I was having a hard time finding a decent guy at bars and clubs, so I decided to give it a try. One night, while scrolling through Tinder, I came across a profile that caught my eye. His name was Pat, and he seemed like a real nice guy. We talked for a while and decided to meet up for a drink. I gave him my address, and he said he'd pick me up at around 7. I put on a nice dress and waited nervously for him to arrive. As I stood outside my apartment building, I saw a car pull up. It was a beat-up old truck. I wondered if it was really him. But when it pulled up in front of my building, I knew it was Pat. He was tall, with short blonde hair and a patchy beard. He wore a plaid shirt and jeans, and had a smile that lit up his face. He walked over to me and gave me a big hug. I felt a little awkward, but also a little excited. We got into his truck, and he asked me if I was hungry. I told him I wasn't, but he said that he knew a great place for drinks. It was a little out of our town, but he promised it would be worth it. I hesitated for a moment, but he seemed so charming and persuasive that I eventually agreed. As we drove out of the town, I noticed the scenery changing. Buildings became fewer and farther between, and the trees got thicker. I began to feel a little worried, but I tried to tell myself that it was just my nerves. After all, I had only just met this guy. When we arrived at the bar, I realized it was not the kind of place I was used to. It was small and dingy, and it smelled of stale beer. There were only a few other people there, and they all turned to look at us when we walked in. I felt even more out of place. Pat ordered us drinks, and tried to get me a shot, but I declined. He kept insisting though, and I eventually gave in. I thought it might make me relax a little. As we sat there talking, all Pat seemed to do was brag about himself. He talked about all the fights that he'd been in, and that he once saved a kid from drowning. I tried to listen and nod along, but I really thought he was full of it. I didn't think he was really the kind of guy I wanted to be with. As the night wore on, I started to feel more and more scared. There was no cell service, and I was in the middle of nowhere with a guy I barely knew. Pat kept trying to get me to drink more, but I started to feel sick. I told him I wanted to leave, but he wouldn't take me. He said that we were having a good time and that I shouldn't spoil it, but I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I made up an excuse and said that I needed to get home. I told him I had an early morning meeting and needed to get some rest. He seemed reluctant, but finally agreed to take me back to my apartment. As we drove back, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but then Pat started to get angry. He said that I was wasting his time, and that he'd driven me all the way there for nothing. I felt my heart racing as he pulled over to the side of the road. He turned to me and said,
"Just get out then. I'm not taking you any further."
I got out of the truck and started walking down the road. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from him. I heard him yelling at me as he drove away, but I didn't respond. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. I just kept walking. As I walked, I felt the cold night air on my skin. I was shivering, and my feet were starting to hurt. I realized I had no idea where I was, and I didn't have any way to call for help. My phone still wasn't working. I felt like I was in a nightmare. I couldn't believe I'd been so foolish to trust this guy. I felt like I put myself in danger, and I didn't know how to get out of it. After walking for almost an hour, I saw a car approaching. I stuck out my thumb and prayed that they would stop. The car slowed down, and I saw an older couple inside. They asked me if I needed a ride, and I almost started crying with relief. They took me to the nearest town and dropped me off at a gas station. I went inside and called a friend to come pick me up. I didn't tell her the whole story, but I told her enough so that she would know that I really needed help. When I got home, I collapsed onto my bed and cried. I couldn't believe what happened. I felt like I'd been so stupid to trust a stranger. After that night, I never spoke to Pat again. I deleted his number and blocked him. It took me a while to get over that experience, but I eventually did. I learned from it, and I grew from it. I promised myself I would never put myself in that kind of situation again. Now whenever I go on a date, I'm more cautious. I make sure to meet up in a public place where there are lots of other people. I also realized that I told Pat my address before we even met. I live in a large apartment building, so it would be difficult for him to find me, but that was also a mistake that I won't make again. I started using Tinder a while ago, and it's been okay. I'd always wanted to meet somebody the old-fashioned way, but my work schedule was really busy, so I finally decided to give it a try. It was around the year 2015, so Tinder was fairly new at the time. After I set my profile up, I started swiping. I was surprised by how many matches I got. It was actually only 3 or 4, but that's still more than I was expecting. One of them was Tanya. She was absolutely gorgeous, with long curly hair. We hit it off right away, and after a few days of chatting, we agreed to meet at a park near my apartment. On the day of our date, I arrived at the park early. It was a nice day. The sun was shining and a gentle breeze was blowing through the trees. The park was quiet, with just a few families and couples scattered around. I found a bench near the spot where we were going to meet. As the minutes ticked by, I became anxious. It was past the time that we agreed on. I checked my phone every few seconds, wondering if she had canceled or gotten lost. As the sun began to set, I started to worry that I'd been stood up. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. A long shadow appeared, cast by the late day sun. I turned to see 3 guys approaching me. They were all around 25 years old, and 2 of them were really large. I felt nervous as they got closer, and tried to brace myself for what was about to happen.
Hey man, how's it going?
One of the guys said. Fine, I replied.
Can you spare a few bucks?
Another of them asked. Sorry, I don't have any change, I told him. I stood up to walk away, but 2 of the guys blocked me. Then one of them said,
Can I see your wallet?
I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us. I don't want any trouble, I said, starting to realize what was happening. I tried to squeeze past them again, but they didn't back down. Instead, they moved closer, and one of them grabbed me by the arm. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like a vice. The other 2 guys circled around me, and they looked really intimidating. I knew I had to act fast. Fueled by adrenaline, I swung my free arm and managed to connect with one of the guys. He stumbled back, clutching his nose, and the other 2 guys paused for a moment. I caught them by surprise. That's when I made a run for it. I darted away from them as fast as I could. I looked back every few steps. I could see them chasing me, but I was clearly the faster runner. I just kept going. When I finally stopped, panting and grasping for air, I realized I had no idea where I was. I was in a part of the city that I'd never been before, with no landmarks to guide me. I checked my phone to figure out where I was and how to get back to my apartment. I looked up a map and finally found my bearings. I called an Uber because I didn't want to risk walking home and having those guys find me. I was really embarrassed about what happened, and I tried to play it off like it was nothing. It wasn't until I got home that I started crying. After I had the chance to calm down, I checked my phone. By then, I was pretty sure that Tanya wasn't real. I figured those guys made a fake profile to lure me into a trap. It wasn't the smartest scam, really, because I actually only had $20 or $30 in cash, and they didn't even get that. When I opened the Tinder app, I was surprised to see a new message from Tanya. It said something like this. Hey, sorry I missed you. I had a family emergency, and I had to take my dad to the hospital. At first, I didn't know what to think. Was this a genuine message, or was she trying to throw me off? Maybe that guy was mad I punched him, and he wanted revenge. I decided to reply, just to see what she would say. I asked her what happened. Tanya replied a few minutes later. It's a long story. My dad had a heart attack and had to go to the hospital. It was really intense. I don't know what to tell you, she said. I didn't believe her for 1 second. There was no way that it was anyone but those 3 men. I didn't call her out directly, on the off chance that it was real. I simply unmatched her and moved on with my life. I was way too embarrassed to call the police. I didn't know how they could find those guys anyway, because I didn't have any real information for them. That was pretty much the end of it. However, a few months later, I was walking down the street near my place, and I'm pretty sure I saw one of those guys step off the bus. He didn't notice me. It was pretty creepy to think that those guys are out there. I keep thinking of how awkward it would be if I ran into one of them at the grocery store or the gym. It hasn't happened yet, but I'll send an update if anything happens. I've been using Tinder on and off for a few years. I'd used other dating apps as well, but Tinder was really popular when I moved to Denver. I remember the first time I saw his profile. His pictures were intriguing, and his bio was witty. I swiped right and then put my phone away for the night. The next time I opened it, I saw that we matched. We started chatting right away, and I found him to be charming, funny, and intelligent. We talked about our interests, our jobs, and our families, and we clicked almost instantly. We decided to meet up at a coffee shop in the city. I remember being nervous, wondering if he'd be as great in person as he was online. But as soon as I saw him, all my worries melted away. He was tall and handsome, with a warm smile. I think he looked even better than his pictures. We hugged and chatted, sipped our coffees, and laughed about silly things that didn't even matter. The conversation flowed easily, and I felt like I had known him for years. After that first date, we started seeing each other more and more often. We went to restaurants, museums, parks, and just walked around the city. We talked about our hopes and dreams, our fears and doubts, and our plans for the future. I felt like I had found someone who really understood me, someone who made me feel loved. But then things started to change. He would text me constantly, even when I was at work or with friends. He would get upset if I didn't reply right away, and accuse me of ignoring him. He would show up at my apartment unannounced, wanting to hang out, even when I had other plans. At first I thought it was just a sign of his affection, a way of showing me how much he cared, but as time went on, it became really overbearing. I tried talking to him about it, but he would just get really defensive and angry. He would say things like that I was the only person he has in the world, and that he can't live without me. He would accuse me of flirting with other guys, and not really loving him. None of that was even remotely true. It was like he was living in a different reality, one where I was the only source of his happiness and meaning in his life. It started to feel suffocating, like I was always walking on eggshells around him. I couldn't be by myself anymore. Couldn't talk to my friends, or do the things that I enjoyed without feeling guilty or anxious. I started to dread his calls and texts, wondering what new demand or accusation would be waiting for me. It was exhausting. And then one day, he showed up at my work. He came in looking for me, and when I tried to tell him to leave, he started shouting and causing a scene. My coworkers had to call security to get him out. It was really embarrassing. Luckily, my boss was super understanding. I wouldn't have blamed him if he fired me over it, but he just told me to take a break and cool down. Then nobody at work ever brought it up again. I love my coworkers. After that incident, I knew I had to end things with him. I tried to do it gently over the phone, but he wouldn't accept it. Begged me to give him another chance, and promised he would change, that he would never do anything like that again. But I knew deep down that things wouldn't get better. I needed to get away from him before things got worse. Then, he started sending even more messages. At first they were just pleading, desperate messages telling me how much he loved me and that he needed me. But then they turned into threats, angry messages accusing me of leading him on or betraying him. He would send me pictures of me and my friends taken from social media and say things like, "I know where you are, and I'm watching you." He would show up at places that he knew I'd be, just trying to catch a glimpse of me. I was scared, and I didn't know what to do. I tried blocking his number, but he would just create new ones. I changed my social media settings to make them private, but he still found ways to see my posts. Even when I went to the police, they said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually hurt me. Crazy, I know. Then one night, I was home alone watching TV when I heard a noise from outside my apartment. I went to the window and saw him standing there, staring at me. I panicked and locked all the doors and windows, then called the police. He started pounding on the door, trying to open it. I could hear him trying to break down the door, but it was too strong. When the police arrived, he was arrested. He spent the night in jail, and I found out that he was really drunk at the time. He was released the next day. I was eventually granted a restraining order because of that incident. After that, things got a lot better. I never found out exactly what made the difference. Maybe it was the fear of legal consequences, or maybe his friends and family stepped in to help. Whatever it was, I'm thankful that things didn't escalate any further. It's been 2 years now, and I'm still afraid that I'll run into him somewhere. If that happens, I'm not sure what I'll do. As I stepped off the plane at JFK, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with nervousness. I'd never been to New York City before, but I was there for a work conference. In the days leading up to my trip, I had downloaded the Tinder app and swiped through countless profiles until I found a match. Her name was Tracy, and she was a student at NYU. We hit it off immediately, and quickly made plans to meet up. She suggested that we watch the sun set in Central Park, and I agreed. I was really happy to have a local to hang out with, because I wouldn't have known what the good things were to do. As I made my way to the park, I felt a sense of awe at the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets. The noise and energy of the city was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, but as I entered the park, the chaos of the city fell away and was replaced by peaceful sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. I spotted Tracy sitting on a bench near the lake. Her long brown hair blew in the wind. As I approached her, she looked up and smiled. I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my body. We spent the next hour watching the sunset, talking and laughing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we decided to walk around the park. We strolled through the winding path, marveling at the scenery. It reminded me of every romantic comedy movie I had ever seen. The night was cool and quiet, and the park seemed almost magical. As we walked, we talked about everything and nothing. Our conversation was flowing. We stopped to take some pictures, and as I held my phone up, I saw a man approaching us. Before I could react, he walked up to us brandishing a gun.
"Give me your wallets and your phones,"
he said, his voice gruff and threatening. Tracy and I froze and started shaking. I wanted to run, but I knew I couldn't. I could feel cold sweat beating on my forehead. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. My hand was still shaking. Tracy did the same. Her eyes were wide with fear. The man took our wallets and phones and then fled into the night, leaving us standing there, alone and terrified. We stood there for a few minutes, too shocked and scared to move. Eventually, we made our way back to the hotel, both of us shaken and traumatized. We called the police right then. The next few days were a blur of police reports and canceled credit cards. I reported my phone stolen, which is supposed to render it useless to thieves. They probably have a way around that though, but I did it anyway. It was a really horrible experience, and I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to return to New York City again. I'd never been mugged before. It's not that common where I come from. Tracy and I kept in touch over the next few weeks, talking on the phone and texting each other. I haven't been back since, and it's been over a year. Tracy and I haven't talked in a while, and I'm sure she's moved on. I don't know if this is the scariest experience of all time. Some of you have probably been through worse, but it was really scary for me.